Greetings and welcome to CHSF 2106. The cool. Okay, I'll lose the glasses. Just give me a sec here. Oh, that seemed funnier in my head. Okay, welcome to part two. Let's get into it. Coming to you from the galaxy of Andromeda. Let's do this. Whatever, if you're gonna use Zoom, may as well try to have a little bit of fun. So, back to our dear friend Jean Piaget and his ideas that people go through these levels of thinking, right? And you've heard me rant about this at length of how when the baby's first born, their entire experience is sensory motor, that they're moving and they're seeing and they're tasting and they're touching and they're hearing and they're smelling and they're, so that's sensory, and they're moving motor, they're moving around. And then as they get older, they move into this pre-operational stage where they're starting to understand things much better, but they're not as good at like doing that mental work in their brain, what he's calling operations, right? Like whether it's like, okay, so if you ask me, for example, what's the difference between in Canada, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party? First, I'd say like, how much time do you have? But then it's like, well, for me to answer that question, I'd have to say, think about what one is, think about what the other one is, think about how they're different, and all that's like kind of complex mental operations, right? So he's saying that like that ability to do work in your brain, to do that operation sort of develops. And so if you look at his stages, it goes like sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, which means, so pre-operational means you're not doing it yet. Concrete operational means you're starting to do it, but you're much more black and white in your thinking. And then formal operation, you see this like increase in abstraction. Adolescents are able to start to purely think of hypothetical situations. They're able to start to reason better. There's a tendency to think about thought itself. Like it's weird that I think like this, like actually starting to think about what their own philosophies are, what their own perspectives are. Formal operational thought is considered to be more abstract than concrete operational. Adolescents are no longer limited to actual concrete experiences as let me say that again. Adolescents are no longer limited to actual concrete experiences as anchors of thought. They can start to conjure up make believe situations or abstract propositions or even events that are totally hypothetical and try to reason logically about them. That quality of this abstract thinking during the formal operational stage is evident in the adolescent's ability to solve more complicated verbal problems. The concrete operational thinker needs to see the concrete elements like A, B, and C to be able to make the logical inference that if A equals B and B equals C, then A plus C, then A must be C. Get that ABC thing. That example I wrote out doesn't really even make sense. It's just basically saying like the better way to say it is that like as kids get older and as they get into teen ways, it's almost like they can't think at their first, they're not really thinking, which is a weird way to say it, but at the sensory motor stage, they're basically sensing and moving. And then they get to this pre-operational stage where it's the beginning of thought, sort of the beginning of memory formation. They're at this like level where they're showing this rudimentary form of adult thought. So something that's going to get there. And then they move to the concrete operational stage where it's like more formal and it's more concrete, I mean, and then the formal, right? So the problem is that he uses the term operational stage for three of the four stages, and it makes it a little bit of a tongue twister to explain. But basically, all he's saying is this additional level. Now it's like the person's leveled up. They can do what they could do before, but now they can think outside the box more. If you were to say like, okay, well, Mike, what specifically do you mean? Like, how specifically are some ways that adolescent thought is different than late childhood thought, right? Because we're saying like how did you start thinking when you were like 13, 14, 15 that was very different than when you were 9, 10, 11? And one of the things is you got better at what's called deductive reasoning, or saying like, okay, well, if where did I leave my keys? Okay, well, if it's not in that room and it's not in that room and it's not in that room and it's not in that room, it must be in the last room. I haven't checked. That's like the simplest thing about deduction, right? Deduction is like figuring out what it is by figuring out what it isn't. That is starting to think like a scientist. That's like the most classic. It's like nowadays people are like, oh, I have this theory, this theory. It's like none of them are theories. A theory is a questionable hypothesis. It's like the basis of science is that you have an idea, right? I think that this is linked to this. And now I'm going to do everything I can to try to prove that I'm wrong. And if I can't, and that's called the principle of falsification. That's like Karl Popper. Karl Popper's a name you should know, Poppr, and he wrote something called like In Defense of an Open Society or Enemies of an Open Society or something like that. But anyways, um, the principle of falsification. That's what science is. Science is having an idea and trying to prove that it's wrong. And if you can't prove that it's wrong, then it stands as a hypothesis, as a theory. A theory is a hypothesis that's been tested. You begin to think, and again, it's like that's what knowledge is supposed to be, right? You have this idea, and it's like that's the idea until we can prove that's wrong or find a better idea, and then that's how science builds, and that's what the scientific method is. It's the process of testing hypothesis. Is hypothesis is hypothesis. Anyways, the plural of the word. Beginning to think more like a scientist, devising plans to solve problems, being more systematic. Okay, another thing that is kind of stereotypical or characterizing of adolescent cognition, of the way that they're starting to think, is this idea of egocentrism, that they're focused on themselves. And that sounds like I'm saying that they're like selfish and self-important, and I'm actually not saying that at all. More what I'm saying is that you're never going to be so self-conscious of yourself and aware of what other people think of you as you were when you were a teenager. It's like this heightened, first of all, you're just way more aware of yourself and of how other people are seeing you, and you care a lot. And so it's this heightened kind of sense of this complicated movie that's my life, right? That this adolescent egocentrism, they're thinking of like ego meaning like self or who you are in the centrism. It's like having this heightened, it's not like you're only focused on yourself, as in like how we would say that about an adult that's only focused on themselves, also almost makes them sound like a bad person. But when you're saying the teenagers only focused on themselves, it's like their social world is so pressurized that they can't help but seeing it from this egocentric perspective. It's actually defense of teenagers, not a criticism of them. Okay, there's also this emergence of an idea of like an imaginary audience. I'm not reading my notes here at all, but right, that this imaginary audience idea, that, and these notes are just, sometimes when I rant I end up like saying basically the same thing. It's like I read these a bunch of times before I do the presentation, but sometimes I just like to have extra points. um yeah, so I say here, adolescence, there's this sense that you're on a stage believing that you're the main actor and others are in the audience, and this imaginary audience can be discerning for parents who see, who used to be their child's hero and now they're like embarrassing to the kid. And that even, man, I'm dealing now with like my daughter wants me to walk her up to school, but I have to like stop a little bit before because she wants to walk up by herself, but if her friends aren't there yet I have to stay. So it's like a very complicated situation that she decides when I can leave, but she wants me to be there, but she also wants to be independent, right? I can just imagine at the teen level, this, suddenly the adolescent wants to walk separately in the mall and is critical of anything the parent wears or anything they say. It's like, oh, that's so embarrassing, mom. Embarrassing to who? Who are you embarrassed of? This imaginary audience. And then the last one is this sense of like a personal fable. That the point I wanted to say about this is that this is like tendency to think you're invincible, right? That you'll live forever. That the personal fable is a part of adolescent egocentrism that involves this feeling of uniqueness and invincibility. No one understands me, especially my parents. No one knows what I'm feeling. And it's not that you're not unique, it's that because you're seeing it so egocentrically and because things matter so much to you, it's almost impossible not to see it in a way that you can't understand how someone else could understand it. It actually sort of makes sense. Adolescents' sense of personal uniqueness makes them believe that no one can understand how they really feel. As part of their effort to maintain this sense of personal uniqueness, they might even tell a story about themselves that's filled with fantasy in a world far removed from reality. These personal fables frequently will show up in adolescents' diaries. It's kind of interesting, eh? Okay, so executive function improves a lot during the teen years. So you can think of executive function as like basically your brain doing all the sort of higher end tasks, right? So this is like planning your goals, decision making, self control. Um, yeah, I said like higher level cognitive processes. And these are all related to the development and the working of the prefrontal cortex. And so one of the other things that's happening during this teen period is that your brain power is increasing. You're getting both a stronger kind of problem solving system with the development of the prefrontal cortex, and you're also getting this increase in cognitive control. You're getting better than you were before at paying attention to things. Getting better at restricting daydreaming and more flexible cognitively. Now, obviously, everyone's not the same, and you might be not nearly as good at controlling your interfering thoughts than your friend, but you're better than you were before. The idea is that this is all compared to how you were before. That one of the things that's characteristic about how is a 15-year-old's brain different than how it was when they were 10 is that there's more higher powered executive functioning and there's more display of cognitive control. Okay, this is I think the last slide, and then it's test review. This idea of top dog phenomena, that this is another interesting thing that happens in school, right? That you get to grade 8 and then all of a sudden you go to grade 9 and you switch from being like the oldest, the what they call the top dog, to being now you're the youngest. Now you can go from the most powerful students in the school to the youngest. High schools are bigger, they're more like bureaucratic, they're more like an institution, they're less personal or more impersonal. It's the same thing as saying less personal. Then middle school or high school, the teachers might not be like making it as relevant. It might not be like tailoring it to you as much. You're also like now in these complex peer groups. Dropout. I wanted to make this point about dropout that's interesting is that when you ask women why they dropped out of high school, oftentimes it's related to either a problem in their family, like a parent issue or a drug related issue, or something related to childcare, either for one of their siblings or maybe they are an adolescent mom. And then when you talk to young men, men are falling out of the university system at an alarming rate. And soon there's not going to be men in the social sciences. It's to a large degree. And it's the why question for that is interesting. Feeling uninvolved and having a desire to make money elsewhere. And some of it's the attraction of the trades. You can make six-figure money and have a good career in other ways, right? But yeah, the reason why men are flocking from higher education in droves is complex and an important question, but a topic for a different day. Let's move on to test review. Okay, I'm just gonna power through these. Many stereotypes of adolescence are too negative. Most adolescents today successfully negotiate the path from childhood to adulthood. However, too many of today's adolescents are not provided with adequate opportunities and support to become competent adults. It's important to view adolescence as a heterogeneous group because it is important to view adolescence as a heterogeneous group because of different portraits of adolescence emerge depending on the particular set. Yeah, heterogeneous just means that there's different. Homogeneous would mean everyone's the same. Heterogeneous means everybody's different. Heterogeneous group means that it's important to just see that there's major variation and differences between different teens. Just sort of obvious. I said that in as confusing of a way as possible. Number two, puberty determinants include things like nutrition, health, heredity, hormonal changes. Puberty occurs approximately 2 years older, more than earlier for girls than boys. I think I said 18 months, depends on the person. Individual variation in pubertal changes is substantial. Adolescents show considerable interest in their body image, with girls having a more negative body image in general than boys statistically. And that idea of early maturing girls being more statistically vulnerable to risks. Changes in the brain during adolescence involve things like the thickening of the corpus callosum and a gap in maturation between the limbic system, the seat of emotion, and the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning and self-regulation part. We talked about that. Adolescence is a time of sexual exploration and experimentation, and early activity can be associated with a number of negative outcomes long term. Adolescence is a critical juncture in health. Poor nutrition and lack of exercise are especially concerning. Many adolescents stay up later than they were when they were children and get a lot less sleep than they need. Oops. Although drug use in adolescence has declined in recent years, it's still a concern. Eating disorders have increased in adolescence, with a substantial increase in the percentage of adolescents who are overweight. Two eating disorders that may emerge in adolescence are anorexia and bulimia. In Piaget's formal operational stage, thought is more abstract, idealistic, logical than in the concrete operational stage. However, many adolescents, even adults, don't necessarily reach that stage. He didn't think it was guaranteed. And then I just got a couple more. Adolescence egocentrism, which involves this heightened sense of consciousness, reflects other cognitive changes in adolescence in addition to Piaget's 3 stages. There's changes in information processing in adolescence that are mainly reflected in improvements in executive function, which includes advances in cognitive control and decision making. Number 12, the transition to middle school or high school is often stressful, and one source of stress is the move from top dog to low dog position. Oops. Okay, I somehow just killed the PowerPoint, but the recording's still going, so let me just go back. I think I was on the very last one too. Overall, high school dropout rate in Canada has gone down quite a bit in the last 20 years, but the dropout for Indigenous youth is very high. I don't think I talked about that directly, but that's an important point for sure. And then this idea of increased emphasis on service learning, like you having to do your high school hours and stuff like that. Okay, I hope that presentation went all right. So now those quiz reviews are just intended to kind of hammer home those points one last time before you write your test. And in addition to that, I hope you have a great day. And thanks for being such an awesome class this year. You'll get more from me still, but this is the last presentation you're going to be assessed on. And yeah, it's been a blast. It's been a tech challenge at times, but again, I know I say this sometimes, but I do want to comment on the quality of people you are at Nipissing and how awesome you've been to work with. Thank you.